welcome everybody to the very first Sentient session, The Power of the Pitch. I'm Anna Bradley, the Executive Director of Sentient Media, and over the last couple of months, our team has been working really hard to pull together this series. So we're really excited to have so many people join us today. This was a sellout event, and we have lots of people on the wait list, so we're thrilled with how much appetite there has been for this. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, Sentient Media is a non-profit journalism outlet, and we report on the costs of animal agriculture. Essentially, we believe in shining a light on the stories that encourage the general public to start thinking about animal lives in different ways to what they used to, particularly farmed animal lives. And through that, we can create transparency and ultimately create change. We do a lot of our own reporting, but we've also built a writers' fellowship program, and that gives writers the tools and mentorship to get their articles published in different outlets. So this year, we've been placed in Wired, The Guardian, USA Today, New York Daily, to name a few. We basically, a month ago, we reached about 90 fellows on our program. So we designed the Sentient Sessions to help elevate their learning to the next level. So over the next 6 months, we're going to hear from a range of people from within the animal protection movement and people from outside the animal protection movement to hear about how we can tell these stories in the most effective, impactful way. But this series is for anyone, particularly anyone who is interested in exploring all the kinds of social justice that you can create through journalism. And that's why we decided to open this to the public. So for today's session, we're reaching our maximum of our attendees now, so we'll get cracking. For today's session, we know sometimes it doesn't matter how fantastic you think your story is, if you don't pitch it right, it will never get read. So today we're going to hear from some fantastic freelance writers, managing editors, and from each other about the power of the pitch. Q&A is open. It should be open at the bottom of your screen, so you can click the Q&A tab and ask any questions you want throughout the session. You can upvote those that you think that need to get answered, and we'll address those when it comes to the Q&A part. And finally, I just want to thank our speakers, our advisors, and all of you fantastic attendees who are here today for our launch. And now I'm going to hand over to Jasmin Stinger, who is a Sentient Media advisor, co-host of the Our Hen House podcast, features editor for Veg News, and she's going to guide us through today's session. Thank you all again, and happy pitching.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jasmin, and I'm so excited that this day is finally here. We've been so much looking forward to Sentient Sessions, and I think we're all huge fans of everything that Sentient Media is doing, and we see media as a key role in creating social justice and social change. And I'm so impressed by the panelists today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with them to really hone in on the best way to advocate for animals through the media. And as Anna said, that starts with pitching. And I have been on both ends of pitching. I think a lot of our panelists have as well. And I can tell you that more than anything, I get terrible pitches and don't even, open them. So I think that we need to kind of flip that on its head, figure out the best way forward so that we can get these pitches at the top of editors' inboxes and really mainstream the movement to end the exploitation of animals. So here's what we're going to do. I'm looking forward to your questions. So as Anna said, make sure to ask them, and we'll be getting to them probably mostly a little bit later, but maybe pepper in a few throughout as well. I'm going to start by doing a general intro to all of our panelists. So panelists, I'll do an intro to you, and then if you could speak briefly about where you are now and how you got started. After that, we'll get into the main presentation where we'll be chatting about pitches that succeed, pitches that fail, and maybe your most important tips for pitching. And after that, we'll have plenty of time for the Q&A, because I know that there's a lot of really engaged, interesting thinkers and writers and activists who are joining us today. So that being said, you already know I'm Jasmin Stinger. I'm an author. I have a book coming out this year, and I've been helming editorial at Veg News, as well as running the media nonprofit Our Hen House. And I also have a lot of experience as a freelance writer. So I'm basically in awe of our panelists today. And I'd love to start by introducing Twilight Greenaway. Twilight is a writer and editor living in Oakland. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Mother Jones, Food and Wine, NPR, and Grist, where she was food editor. She is also a contributing editor of Civil Eats. So, Twilight, if you don't mind just giving us a little bit more of a glimpse into where you are now and how you got started, and then a little bit later, we'll circle back around to you to get all of your magical thoughts on pitching.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Jasmin, and Sentient Media, and Anna. So I was raised on a farm, and food and agriculture have been integral to my understanding of the world. And I've been working on food and ag reporting for somewhere around 10, 12 years, something like that. And I've been involved with Civil Eats since 2014. When I sent in my bio, I was technically called the contributing editor, although it wasn't a very accurate description of what I do there. And since the pandemic started, I've actually been doing more. So at this point, we're calling me a senior editor. I work on editing most of the policy stories, and I was working on a series about rural America for the last 2 years on and off. And I've also been working on the op-eds lately. So I take on a lot, and I work with a great team. We have about 8 people at this point, including 3 senior reporters, but we also are always looking for freelance stories. We work with a number of freelancers. That's me.
Great. Well, I know we'll have, I already see questions coming in, which is cool, but let's transition to chat with Rachel first. Rachel Krantz, good friend of mine, and she is the namer of Bustle, which I think is super cool, and one of its 3 founding editors. And at Bustle, she served as the senior features editor for 3 years and senior news editor before that. She also worked at the Daily Beast as homepage editor, and her work has been featured on Vox, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, NPR, The Daily Beast, Newsweek. Okay, it goes on in a lot of places. And she is the recipient of the Peabody Award, amongst other things. So Rachel, if you could just give us a brief intro about where you are now and how you got started, and then we'll circle back around to some of your further thoughts.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Like Jazz said, I started at the Daily Beast and then went on to helping found Bustle. Was there for almost 4 years, and then I shifted to working for Mercy for Animals. I wanted to get out of the machine that I'd helped create and work for a cause I really believed in. And there, I did a mix of things, writing for the organization, but also sort of working as an almost funded freelancer on the Vegan Beat, trying to place stories that not just benefited the organization, but educated the public. And since then, I ended up leaving. It was a difficult choice, but to work on my first book right now, which is coming out in next year. And that book is about non-monogamy, among many other things. And we'll have some animal rights messaging snuck in little bits as well. And I do a little bit of consulting on the side as well.
I love that you're like, it's about non-monogamy. I think everyone's like, oh, okay, it's not about animal rights explicitly, but what I think is so great about the way that you message everything, Rachel, is that you put yourself in it. And we're going to get to that as well, about like how that kind of personal narrative can play a role in a winning pitch. So let's talk to Jesse Hirsch, the Counter's managing editor. Before he joined the team, he was an investigative food editor at Consumer Reports. His stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bon Appetit, Vice, Eater, and The Guardian. Jesse, if you don't mind just giving us a brief glimpse into what you're doing now and how you got here, and then we'll scroll back around for some of your tips.
Sure. About 10 years ago, I graduated from state school with a journalism degree and just took the first job that I got, which was a reporting position at a small town in Wisconsin. So I started doing just basic crime and politics reporting. until I moved back to the Northeast where I'm from. And it was very accidental that I fell into food and agriculture. I was living in Queens, New York, and there was a new food magazine called Edible Queens, and I loved it. And I found a typo on the website, and I actually sent an email to the publisher in the middle of the night. I was like, "Hey, I found a little glitch, and by the way, do you need any help?" And she was brand new, and she was overwhelmed, and said, "Sure." So it was kind of just right place at the right time. At first, I did a little pro bono work for her, and then ended up being her deputy editor for a bit. And I didn't know that much about food and agriculture at that time. I mean, I liked to cook at home, I liked to eat out at restaurants, but I didn't know what everything was. So I just, over the years, it's kind of been an evolution a little bit. I freelanced for a while for Village Voice and the Wall Street Journal, and then I was in San Francisco, and I was a restaurant critic, and eventually fell into kind of more serious, like not foodie, talking about restaurant gossip and things like that, and more what's actually going on between the food getting produced and then how it reaches our plate. And that's what the counter does mostly. It's food and agriculture, business, policy, kind of the stories about what makes the food system what it is. So we have a newsroom of about 12 staff now, and then we take a lot of freelance stories as well.
Well, thank you. I remember being the senior editor at Veg News and being on the other end of those emails where they said, "Here are all of the typos in the last issue." And I was like, who is this person? I tried not to be
obnoxious. Yeah, I know.
Who is this person? We should hire them. Anyway, okay. Our final panelist is Leighton Woodhouse. And Leighton is a journalist and Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker. His print stories have appeared in The Intercept, Gawker, The New Republic, Newsweek, Vice News, The Nation, and The All. He has directed documentary videos for The Intercept, The Nation, KQED, The Fusion Network, and Participant Media. Leighton has a master's degree in sociology from UC Berkeley. Leighton, if you could give us a feel for where you're at right now and how you got here, and then we'll circle back around for some more of your tips.
I came into journalism actually pretty late. I think out of college for the first decade or so, I came out of an activism and organizing background and kind of stumbled into journalism. I do both print and documentary filmmaking. So I used to cover, before I got into animal rights stuff, I was covering all types of issues: police reform, immigration, things like that, labor, and then I started writing for a number of outlets, and then kind of landed with The Intercept primarily is where I both write and produce videos for. And so that's what I've been doing for quite a while now. And that's been my home primarily for the animal rights related work that I do. But I would say, I used to do probably 60-40 print to video. Now it's probably 80% of what I do is video now. So yeah, that's my background.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is an incredible panel. And so let's get into it and make sure that if you have some questions, be sure to type them. We will do our best to get to all of them. You can also just vote the questions up if you prefer that. So what I'd love to do is circle back around to each of you and get a feel for like a pitch that has succeeded. You could either be specific, or if you want to speak it in generalities, that's fine too. Maybe one that failed. And of course, I want to also understand your most important tip for pitching, which does speak to one of the questions here, which is from Pierce Anderson. And it says, how many pitches do you send out before giving up on a piece, if it is semi-evergreen? So going somewhat out of order, Jesse, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts on pitching. And if you can address that question from Pierce, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I feel like the number of, I'll go with your last question first. The number of times that you send out a pitch really depends on how strongly you feel about it being out there in the world. If you feel like you just have not gotten the editor in front of the right set of eyes, then I think, and you believe in it, you think that a lot of people would like to read it, then it might just be about reforming the pitch, tailoring it to a different media outlet, not letting rejection get in your way of keeping on going with that. A pitch that I just thought of that we really liked, and kind of the point of this is that it was a story that was kind of out there in a bunch of other outlets, but that didn't mean that we wouldn't still take a piece on it. Back in February and March, there were a lot of stories going around about supermarket shelves being empty. People were panic shopping and hoarding, and it was something that you saw everywhere. And so the story kind of seemed played out, and I can see why you might be like, well, there's nothing left to do about this. You know, the story's been told before. But we got a pitch from a writer that we had never worked with before, who said, well, what about what's the psychology behind the things that are left behind? What do people not get during a crisis? And she suggested speaking to the type of professionals that we wouldn't even have necessarily thought of for a story like this, psychologists and historians looking back at older crises like Hurricane Katrina. What things did people leave behind on supermarket shelves at that time, and kind of gave it a nice broad overview. And so it was interesting because we had thought internally, we're not going to write about panic shopping and hoarding anymore. The story's over, but it was just kind of testament to the fact that you can still look for a new angle on something that's already been out there for a while. And as far as pitches that we don't take, I think in general, it's people that don't necessarily know exactly what it is that, and this would be my tip later too, number one tip of pitching, people that don't necessarily know what types of stories the outlet they're pitching run. That aren't just familiar with the work that we do. And so we might get something that's highly specific, like we would like to cover this nonprofit organization in Austin that's doing really important work for the anti-hunger movement. But, you know, at the counter, we do all national stories that kind of are about things that are going to affect everyone from coast to coast. And if we were going to do a local story, it would have to tell a broader picture. So I feel like a lot of times it's people that have not necessarily looked into this other things that we run when they pitch us. And it's a shame because, you know, they might be a very good pitch, but it just doesn't make sense for us specifically. So.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel have anything to add about being pitched in a way that does not necessarily match the outlet? Twilight?
Sure, yes. I mean, I think that happens a lot for us too. I think that similar to what Jesse's saying, people sort of wrapping their heads around what that means to scale up from local coverage to national coverage, or even scale down. Sometimes we get pitched by folks who are very internationally focused, and we focus on the US food system and how do you angle it so that this is about the way the US impacts what's happening in Africa, for instance. That's a big one. I mean, I made myself a little list. There are things that do work for us, and I think they're factors that play into most successful pitches, and it's about what we haven't thought of, and we're sitting there all day looking at this coverage and related coverage, so it's actually pretty difficult to find the stories we haven't in some way kind of touched on or thought of. If you can come up with something we haven't, we're a lot more interested, even if you're green, even if, you know, you may need help working on the piece. Also, I think if someone doesn't actually have the access that's required of the piece, that's a really common misstep for folks who are new to this. I did it a little bit in the beginning too. I would get really excited about a kind of story I wanted to tell, and I'd be like, of course I'm going to get this access, and I wouldn't secure the access. And so that happens often, that people will pitch us something and they'll be like, I want to be inside the pork processing plant, and we're like, great, which one? Who's going to let you in? So I'd say that's another common mistake, is not doing that pre-reporting and not making sure you actually have the right access to tell the story. I don't know how much you want me to go on.
I'd love if you continued. Yeah, I'd love to know just your for like what in general what you have found works and doesn't.
Yeah. So we do publish a number of op-eds on our site, and so we're always looking for people who have either some kind of expertise that makes them the right person to tell that story, or they can convince us that they're the right person to share that perspective, either because of some access they have or some expertise or perspective that's unique to them. And then one other thing I wanted to offer, because I think this is really helpful for newer writers, is if you can offer quick turnaround on something that's really timely and newsy, that can be really valuable, because we just don't always have the bandwidth. We're a small operation, and if you're willing to, say, sit in on a Zoom conversation that's important and write that story and have it for us on Monday, and the Zoom conversation happened on Friday, we are more likely to take that pitch seriously. If you're like, I'm here, I can spend time on it over the next day or the next 2 days, that can sometimes be really appealing because it's, as you know, I'm sure, Jasmin, it's hard if you're ever doing anything quick turnaround and you want to do that and you don't have the people available. So those are 3 or 4 things that I think can
you still hear me? I'm having a bit of a tech problem here. Hang on one second.
I can now, yes. In terms of my own pitches, I would say that usually when I've had success, it has been because I've been in the right place at the right time.
Okay. Can you all hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, sorry. I have this this tech problem that keeps all right, that's not your problem. Anyway, I think that's really valuable. I think that's really valuable insight, Twilight, and I'd love it if you could also speak to whether how often you accept solicitations as opposed to pitches. So a full article being written and sent to you, like what is the likelihood that you're going to accept that?
Good question. It happens occasionally. I would say we are much more interested in pitches because we can sort of have a say and participate in the shaping of the story. But we do on occasion take stories that are fully or close to fully formed, especially if someone says, I've given it a shot, this is what I have, but I'm also open to edits. One other thing I was going to say about a pitch recently that I did that didn't work because I thought it might offer some insight. I've been doing a lot of research for a story that I see as being this like really long, sprawling project, and I've been having a hard time figuring out where to place it. I'd like to place it somewhere that would give me the space. And I made the mistake of pitching it somewhere fairly high and just including too much information because I'd been doing so much reporting and I was so excited about it. And the editor was really nice and said, what you're pitching sounds way too broad. And I think that that's common when we start doing pre-reporting and when we start really digging into things that excite us, it can be easy to overwhelm an editor with too much and not to get narrow enough and not to be focused on, say, a single character or a single newsy item that draws people in.
Well, and somebody actually has a great follow-up question for you here, Twilight. Flora Dawes. Twilight, how do you get access to the journalists to tell them that they can turn around a story fast?
Well, they have to come to us. That's the thing. If there's something you want to cover quickly and you have to learn about it, it can be really tricky. But if you're keeping your eyes on timely things that are happening and you can let us know that it's something you are excited to write about and you have the time to do it quickly, then that's usually how it works.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I also can understand from like the writer's perspective that it would be difficult to know how to find the editors. So, I guess if you can add anything to that, not to continue to put you on the spot, but if I had some folks find me on Twitter yesterday. So I think that's one way. Do you have any additional insight about how to find the editors?
If you're a woman and you're on binders, most of the binders include a lot of them include lists of editors. That's one way to do it. I think Twitter can be great. You mean so that you don't have to go through a general editor at or info at email address? I mean, I think most of us do keep an eye on those email addresses. We do note when, especially if a subject line says timely pitch or quick turnaround pitch, that could really help.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a matter of just finding it, like looking at mastheads and looking at about pages and Googling it.
And some editors just don't want to be found. Unfortunately, I'm not one of the editors, but a lot of folks would rather their email address not circulate because they don't want to get overwhelmed, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, there can be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pitches that land in our inboxes each week. And so it is unrealistic to respond to all of them. And so I guess with that, I'll switch to Rachel. Rachel, it can be, as I just said, very difficult to get the attention of an editor, and you have been on both ends of that. So I'd love to start with any tips that you have for like how to get the attention.
Sure, yeah. Well, when I was at Bustle, I was just completely overwhelmed, and I think they've since maybe used Submittable, but I was fielding like all of the pitches alone, and it was well over 100 emails a day, plus the many other pieces I had to edit. So for me, I was having to make split-second decisions often, like on whether to open it based on the subject line alone sometimes. I had filters set so that, you know, pitches were filtered to a different inbox, and if it was flagged with certain terms that seemed like PR, like that was going to be moved to a PR inbox. So one thing I would say is like make sure that it's not reading like vague PR emails, which, you know, you can just Google what those tend to look like. And of course, like everyone's saying, like that it's right for the tone of the site, that it hasn't been done already recently. I thought having in the subject line basically like what your headline is, or timely, time sensitive, if it's pegged to news, like that's in the headline of what that news is. I know a lot of people always say like don't attach a full draft pitch first. In my experience, when I was on the other end, I really tend to disagree with that. I tended to not follow that advice at all, and I would send full drafts when possible, and I found I had a lot more success with that than when I pitched if it was a cold pitch. And I also I kind of fight dirty. I didn't follow advice that some old school people have of like, wait for, you know, pitch individually. You know, I think when you really get to the high up ranks, like the New York Times, if you're really gonna give a good shot, yeah, you might really offend an editor there if you're like, oh, sorry, you know, like Vice already took it. But in general, I feel like people take so long to respond to pitches that if it's very timely at all, it's best to just email personalized pitches to a broad scope of editors. On the rare chance that they do say, oh, I'd love this, and someone else took it. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, now you're in more demand, you kind of look good if like, oh, I'm sorry, blah, blah, already published it because it was timely, but I do have this other pitch for a story I'd love to do for you. So that's my advice on that. Let's see, I wrote down a bunch else.
Yeah, actually, I just want to add one thing before you hop in, because I've been on the other end of Rachel's pitches, and, you know, for one that, like, just a really specific one that came to mind that worked was Rachel pitching Veg News for a Father's Day gift guide. And so, you know, as an editor, knowing Father's Day was coming up, like kind of in my, you know, in the back of my mind, and then, oh, Rachel said she could write that, and here are a sample grouping of a few things she's going to include in it. And here's what I know Rachel, so I know she's good to write it. But if it was like a blind pitch, then she would say a few things about why she's the right person to write it, like what contacts she has. And so, and you keep it really short. So I just kind of wanted to add to that, since it was like a real life example of a pitch that worked.
Sure,
I'd love to hear more.
We know each other, and of course, like a gift guide, that's the lightest of the light things I would do. It's a different thing than serious investigative journalism. But yeah, I had a story that I was working on while I was at MFA that really, for months, about vegans in the military. And it was just, you know, I'd done hours and hours of reporting, and I was trying to do it the old-fashioned way of just like pitching the story idea, and I was getting a lot of nice responses, but basically like, this is too specific. Like it was too much of an abstract idea of like vegans in the military, who cares? But then I was like, fuck it, I'm just gonna write this story. And I did, and The Guardian took it. And I, again, said like, I'm open to edits, and we really worked on it together, but she was able to see, okay, this is what this is. Like I can see it's legit, not even knowing this person or what her qualifications are. Although I would say if you do have any qualifications, that's another piece of advice, to put that in the headline. So obviously I'm lucky that I can say like, pitch from Bustle founding editor, but I think that sometimes like gets it open. So if you have any, you're high up at an organization, but qualifications could also be something else. People are really interested in lifting up voices of more marginalized populations right now. If you're a person of color and you feel that's relevant to the story, don't be afraid to put that in the subject line at all. Like, use whatever you have on your side and just assume that the editor is completely swamped with work and overwhelmed. Assume they're getting tons of pitches all the time. Be really respectful of their time. Keep it so brief. Have your intro to yourself be, like a 2-sentence bio that hyperlinks any past stories you've done. And if you don't have all that already, don't be discouraged, but don't start with the New York Times. Don't be ashamed to work your way up to build a portfolio that can eventually build a website you can link to. Be modest and pay your dues at publications that might have smaller names or less pay until you can build your credibility with other outlets. So yeah, I have more, but that's a lot for now.
Yeah, that's great. I do have follow-up questions, but I'll get to Leighton first. So Leighton, I'd love to hear just in general some pitches that have worked and not worked for you. But if you don't mind starting with this great question from Tiffany Atkins here, how do we reach the mainstream media about animal rights related stories? That's the big, oh, you're muted. And that's the big question. So if you could just solve the whole conundrum, we would just really appreciate it.
That's not an easy one. There are not many outlets that cover animal rights, animal welfare, or even factory farming on a regular basis. The Guardian has a huge a funding pool from Open Philanthropy to cover factory farming issues. So they're a good source. They're looking for those stories. The Intercept has been doing more and more. The New York Times has actually done quite well, but I doubt many of those pieces are by freelancers, if any. But yeah, that's kind of, it's not a question I have a ready answer for. I would say find a human angle to the story. If the story is pigs are treated horribly, and here's one example of the way they are, that is not as appealing, in my opinion, to most editors as, I don't know, there's a whistleblower on a factory farm who's making a big deal of this, like something that can connect to either a human protagonist or even a labor issue or something where you can talk about the animal welfare, animal rights piece of it, but in conjunction with, I don't know, a story about climate. I mean, it sucks that we have to do that, but it's just the reality, in my opinion, that in order to be able to appeal to editors and to be able to appeal to an audience of readers that are not, conditioned to care about this issue on its own merits, you have to find these side doors in. As far as pitches go, I don't have any standout pitches that I've done where I'm super proud of this particular pitch. I would just say that a lot of it comes down to, I've written pitches that have anywhere from like practically writing the whole story and cold pitching at places to like literally texting an editor and being like, hey, what do you think about this? And they're like, sure. And whether they say yes or no, in my view, depends much more on your relationship with that editor than the strength of the pitch. I've written from some very solid pitches that have gotten nowhere, and I've written some totally flimsy, half-assed, half-baked pitches that have gotten greenlit because it was an editor who I've worked with before, and they know my track record. There's an informal relationship. So I think it's a hard place to get to, but once you get to a place where you're regularly writing for the same outlet and for the same editor, it becomes much easier. A mistake I've seen, the most typical mistake I see from people who ask for my advice is when people come up with people who are just starting out, I think oftentimes they'll be like reading stories in the news and something grabs their attention. Say it's like ventilation shutdown. in the due to coronavirus. They've read 3 stories about it, and they're like, this sounds horrible. This is something I want to cover. And then they dash off a pitch that says, this is what ventilation shutdown is. It's egregious. I want to cover it. And that's it. Or, maybe there's some appeal to your personal biography as a reporter. I grew up on a farm, and so I have unique insights into this. It doesn't really cut it, in my view. I think this is hard to ask of people who are being paid very, very little for the stories they publish, especially when you're starting out and you might be getting paid like $300 for a story that you work a week on. But the pre-reporting is crucial. Like if you have a pitch that says, this is about ventilation shutdown, and here there are specific, I've talked to this farmer, and I've talked to this farm worker, and I've talked to this activist, and we're going to zero in on this company, and this is the larger ramifications of the story, and you're able to distill that into a paragraph because you've done the legwork of doing that initial pre-reporting. Much, much, much likelier that you're going to get taken seriously by an editor. That said, I've only been on the pitching side. I've never been on the receiving side of this. So other folks on this call might know better than me about that.
Does anyone have anything to add about that? Twilight?
Yeah, I just want to agree that is a much more successful pitch usually when we know who you're going to talk to, what your specific angle is.
Jesse?
I was just going to say, it can sometimes seem frustrating, like a lot of people you were talking about that you have much more success when you know the editor that you're pitching to. And sometimes when you're just starting out, it can seem like everyone knows editors and that you're going to get shut out because you don't, right? You haven't made those connections yet. Pitching to that you have not made that connection. Don't be disheartened or think that you're not going to reach them. You might just have to work a little bit harder. You might need to make it more clear what your experience is that makes you the perfect person to write this particular story. It might need to be a little more grabby in the subject line. You can break through that. You don't need the connections. They are very helpful later on down the line.
One thing I would add to that,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Is that flattery can go a long way. A lot of editors are frustrated writers, so check out if they have written something recently and if you can genuinely compliment it or it's related in any way. Maybe lead with that. Show that you've respected their work or done your research. Another suggestion I would have is because it can be so hard to break in to certain outlets, I've sometimes had success with starting lower on the totem pole, so to speak. I guess that's a terrible expression. But emailing writers or even bloggers who write for those sites about similar topics, whose work you admire, forming the relationship with them first and casually reaching out of hey, I have this story, if you're having trouble finding the editor's email, if you really build a relationship with them, maybe they'll even pass it on for you. But building relationships with whoever you can. I agree it's very difficult, but Twitter is one place you could begin to do that. And again, starting with even thinking about can I give something to this editor or writer first before I'm asking for anything, even if it's just a compliment or sharing their work consistently before you ask for anything.
Yeah, I think that definitely also speaks to, being familiar with their beat, being familiar with what section the story you're pitching might fit into and why. I agree. If I'm on the other end of a pitch and it starts with someone specifically saying something about my column, I'm very flattered, and then they have my attention. Anyway, I did want to kind of go back to that big question, which Leighton did a great job of addressing, but I want to see if any other panelists have any advice on how to get the mainstream media to pay attention to vegan stories or to animal rights stories. And if you have specific experience with that, Rachel, you've had a lot of stories covered by very mainstream press about about animal rights. So I just would love to know, like, that's what we all want to do. That's like what the point of this panel is. So I want to make sure that we have a little bit more energy that we're putting into this particular question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, well, Leighton had good advice of like, find the human angle. This is an incredibly intersectional issue, so that shouldn't be difficult. You know, it's a health story, it's a environmental story, it's a personal story. Like, there's no shortage of other angles to come in it at where you don't even need to use the V word or say animal rights. And you can, you know, have something ready that you're ready to peg to news stories that tend to resurface, and you might want to hold on to it until a specific holiday or until a specific issue is surfacing again. If it's about, you know, has an immigration rights angle, I would wait until there's some news around that rising to the top again, rather than pitching that right now when that's not really where people's focus tends to be. So be aware of other things that are happening we're already perceived as being in our vegan bubble, not paying attention to the rest of the news. So consider yourself an ambassador, not just writing this story, but also representing the movement as a whole when you're pitching, as not like disconnected. I'd say also, like, you know, go ahead and follow me on Twitter and then copy whoever else I'm following, because I put a lot of time and work into finding, like, at least as of a couple of years ago, I'm sure it's changed a lot and hopefully there's a lot more, but pretty much like every editor that's already vegan and a lot of the writers too. So even in that list, you should find a lot of places to start with people who are already sympathetic, and again, trying to begin building those relationships digitally with those people.
And Rachel, would you think that it would be useful to write out pitches in advance that can be written out in a more evergreen way and then tailored to the specific like news story that might be a tie-in?
Sure, if that's the way you work best. I don't know. I've never done that. But yeah, so that you have everything ready if you know something's evergreen or you're saving it for later. But yeah, definitely make sure it's tailored to that outlet as much as possible. But if you start with a template, I don't think you should have to start from scratch each time if you're pitching the same story lots of times. It should look original, but don't start from scratch each time. I mean, it's incredibly labor intensive. It's ridiculous. The editors are the gatekeepers, and it's not their fault they have so little budget and money. But as a freelancer, it's also really hard, and a lot of begging for hardly any money or attention. And like, that's why I'm kind of a little more on the side of the freelancer, of doing whatever they got to do to get in there and not adhering to maybe some of the more old school rules. And on that note, I mean, one of my other main pieces of advice, this is a whole other like idea that I'm available to talk with you individually about. If you want to reach out, I can consult with this on an individual basis. But I think that doing what I did, working for a nonprofit as a freelancer, doing some writing for them, but also covering the issue, that's a potential avenue that I haven't seen explored that much by people, that I could think could be a real win-win, that, you know, Sentient Media is doing. But also there's lots of smaller organizations that might be open to a pitch of a job like that. And it's potentially a more sustainable way to have a freelance lifestyle.
Yeah, that makes me think of a piece of advice I was given when I was very young, when I was 24, to find someone who was doing what I wanted to do, who was like maybe 5 years ahead in their career of where I was, and take them out to lunch. And I was, you know, this was 15, 20 years ago, and I was living in New York City, and I found someone. I had like access to an editor at Teen People, which wasn't exactly where I wanted to be, but it was like an editor who I got his attention, and I took him out to lunch, and then we forged a relationship. So like the 2020 version of that is Rachel offering that, like taking her up on it. And like, that is partly where the networking comes in. So I want to go back to Leighton for a second because Claire has a question that I think is a great one. So on Leighton's point, is it really important to have already made contacts with interviewees when you pitch if you're a pretty new freelancer? Do editors want evidence of your ability to make those contacts?
I would say yes, definitely. If you're going to put in your pitch that you're going to deliver, you know, a particular an interview or a protagonist in your story, you know, it's going to be very disappointing if you come back and you say, well, this person isn't calling me back. Generally, I make my pitches very much pegged on that. Like the first thing I think about is my access to the story. You know, if talking to a lot of sources all the time, whoever your sources are, it might be advocate and, you know, NGO or whatever, or, you know, if you're really digging, it could be workers, then you know, generally that source is going to be is going to feature prominently in the story. That's your access point. Find out from that person who else they can put you in touch with. And in your pitch, you know, I would say the story is going to focus around this person who I've already spoken to. But you can also feel free to say, I will seek out interviews with these other folks who you haven't locked down yet. Just be transparent about it and say, no, I haven't, like editors can't reasonably expect you to have like put a week's worth of pre-reporting into this and interviewed everybody. That's the whole point of being greenlit, is so you can go forward and do that. So I think it's okay to say, I've talked to this one person. These are the other folks you know, if this is a greenlit, these are the other folks I'm going to try to include in this, without making any firm promises. I think most editors would find that totally reasonable.
I'll just add that I think their editors can usually tell which are the harder types, you know, of contacts to make. And so I would say make the harder contact first, right? Make the one that's less likely, the person who's less likely to call you back. Make sure that's the person you've locked in first.
Thank you. Leighton, I'm going to stick with you with also sticking with Claire here, because so another great question from Claire. Is it okay to pitch an idea, but be honest that you would like help developing it if you can show that it's a good fit for the outlet?
I would probably avoid that. I would make the lift as easy as possible on the editor's end. You know, if you're, just bear in mind that the editor's job is not to assist you in building your career. And that's not how they think of their job. So, you know, if you send them a note, this is just brutally honest. If you send somebody a note saying, you know, I've got this idea, but it's not fully developed yet, but I would love to work with you and try to develop it. You know, and again, folks who are actually editors on this call should chime in on this because I'm kind of projecting, but I would imagine that most editors would look at that and be like, this just sounds like a pain in the ass. And it's just much easier to ignore that email or pass on it. So yeah, I would say my answer would be no, I don't think you should do that.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
I would just say that this also is kind of a question of how new to this you are, or how well you know the editor that you're talking to. If it's a writer that I've worked with a bunch in the past and have had really good experiences with them, and they've done a great job, then at that point they can get a little bit more casual. They can have a kernel of an idea and be like, hey, I've got this idea. What do you know, what angles do you think that maybe I could pursue? It's not quite fleshed out yet, and I might be more willing to do that. But if it's a first-time pitcher and they're saying, hey, I'm not quite sure what I'm pitching you, that's kind of a red flag. So it might be something that, I mean, we do get so many pitches every week that, you know, something like that might be just enough to be like, sorry.
Is there like the danger of like exploitation of the pitcher? Like, is there the danger of someone's going to pitch you and you're not going to accept it, but you really like that idea and then you're just going to run with it? I'm going to just ask that to anyone on the panel.
Yes. It does happen.
Yeah, I mean, not these fine people, obviously, but there's Sonia Weiser on Twitter is another really good person to follow, and subscribe to her newsletter is a great resource for freelancers. She basically follows everyone who's an editor, and their calls for pitches. And sometimes, and then she rounds it up every week along with a bunch of resources, so you can just get that digest and not be on Twitter all the time. So I'd really recommend her. But yeah, she'll sometimes add a note of like, and with this, there was a whole thread about how this outlet like stole a pitch. And of course, you know, some things freelancers will claim like, oh, they stole it, but it's just an idea that's not that specific and it's arguable. But I do know people that's happened to, for sure. But again, with us, like, okay, part of what we're doing, if we believe in this, is like disseminating, normalizing this as a beat to cover, as an issue to cover. Maybe that's not the worst thing in the world if sometimes they're like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, do another story on this important issue. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Jesse?
I would, I mean, I think that most newsrooms that are responsible would try to avoid that at all costs. I mean, that's just kind of a basic ethical no-no, that if someone pitches you something, you can't pick that up and then give it to one of your staff writers. That said, I mean, I've heard enough freelancers have direct, you know, say, hey, I pitched this exact same story to this outlet. It happens. It does happen out there. But so that kind of has something to do with knowing about where you pitch to. I mean, Sonia Weiser, she is a good resource. And there's other people too who kind of give good summaries on Twitter of newsrooms that, you know, maybe have a little bit of a iffy track record, or ones that will generally treat you well. But, you know, for the most part, I think that you can feel safe that if it gets turned down, that is on the merits of its own thing, and it's not just so that it can get swooped up and used by that outlet for free.
Or that it's been in the works by that outlet for a while.
That's true. That's always hard.
The number of times that we've been working on something and we publish it, and a freelancer says like, wait a minute, I pitched that to you, and we're like, 5 other people pitched it to us because it's in the zeitgeist. And that's the really tricky thing, is if you're paying attention and you are noticing, that's a good sign. I know it doesn't feel good in the moment, but if you pitch something and the outlet publish it, it's a great sign that you're like on track to be writing the kinds of stories they want to do. So take that as a encouragement.
And we always tell, if that's the case, I try to get out in front of that right away and be like, I'm sorry, we already have someone working on a story on that very thing, just so they're not surprised when they see it on Twitter in a few weeks.
Do you respond to all of those emails, Jesse? Do you respond to all your pitches?
We do, eventually. I mean, I can't say that it's going to happen within a week. Like the less timely pitches, it might be as long as 2 weeks before you hear back. But I think putting timely in the subject line, somebody mentioned that a while back. That is kind of something that makes us look at it right away rather than kind of triage and put it aside.
Well, just a follow-up question, if you don't mind. There's a question here from Alexa, which talks about the exclusivity of pitches. And if Jesse, if you don't mind weighing in, if anyone else also has thoughts on this, like can freelancers pitch to multiple places simultaneously? Because frequently we see, you know, especially with op-eds, like you can only pitch one at a time. But I have a friend who is very successful in placing op-eds, like more so than anyone I know. And it's because he totally ignores that rule and pitches like 300 outlets at once.
Yeah. Yeah, Rachel was talking about that before. We're not sniffy about that. If we did accept a pitch and the person said, ooh, sorry, I already landed it somewhere else in the interim, especially if it's been a little while since we got back to them, don't be like, congrats, you know, we're glad that you placed it somewhere. But I know that in my career, I had a situation where I had pitched multiple outlets and in San Francisco, and the second outlet, the one that responded after the first one, they were kind of irritated that I had done that and acted like it was a bit of a rookie move, you know, like, well, you should have waited until you heard back from us. So, I mean, there are different outlets that have different attitudes towards that practice.
I will say that has burned a couple bridges for me. I do remember sometimes when that happens, if it's someone who's brand new and we don't know at all and they do that, it's usually not. I mean, and to Rachel's point, like that, building the relationship with the editor may not be as big of a priority at that point. And so I understand that, but it can be really frustrating. There's this Venn diagram that I think about a lot with working with writers around, are they easy to work with? Do they have really great ideas? Are they really strong writers? And if you have 2 of those 3 things, you can usually get by. Like you can be a really difficult person if you're a great writer and you have great ideas.
Yeah, I think if it's a timely exclusive, maybe, I mean, or just an exclusive either way, try not to submit too much of that simultaneously, because that's kind of part of the offer of it being an exclusive, is like that there's some scoop there, and there should be a reason why maybe it would be intriguing for it to be an exclusive, rather than just like putting that in and it's not even that newsworthy or something. Like, there should be a reason. But that said, if you have like a scoop and it's very, very timely, I wouldn't wait 2 weeks for some outlet to get back to you and screw yourself out of ever publishing the story, because they might just not see it in their inbox. So it's kind of that dance of using your judgment and learning maybe through some error.
And we often will get responses from people when they pitched us something timely and they say, it's been 48 hours, I have to pitch this elsewhere. And we really respect that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I by the way, I'm going to get to Lisa Warden's very, very upvoted question, but it is a little bit off topic, but I promise I'll get to it. So I have a question here that feels like it's related, which is pitching an op-ed different, or do the same rules apply? And, that's a broad question, but like, let's talk about that for a second. A lot of the people attending this, probably really want to get op-eds published, especially right now. And there is the question of exclusivity. There's the question of like targeting the right outlet. Like Rachel, you said before, don't necessarily start with the New York Times, but maybe there's an exception when it's an op-ed. So I'm just going to throw out the topic of op-eds briefly, which is, do any of the rules that any of you have stated since we started chatting feel different when it comes to op-eds? Are you still putting timely in the subject? Are you still making it a story that is relevant to what's going on in the cultural zeitgeist? Is there a little bit more wiggle room there? And how do you handle exclusivity? That's a lot of questions. So if anyone wants to weigh in with just anything on op-eds, that would be great.
Well, I feel like saying exclusive for an op-ed would be kind of weird, right? I mean, I don't know, it's obviously exclusively your point of view, but did you get I meant an exclusive.
Well, I meant an exclusive pitch to that. Like, are you doing it one by one?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would say similar advice. If it depends how timely it is, make clear why, if you have a particular marginalized identity or specific identity that can speak to this, put that up front in the headline, in the subject line, maybe even, because there'd be particular interest in that. In Sonia Weiser's newsletter and on Twitter, like a lot of times there'll be specific call outs for certain identities of writers to submit. Maybe pay attention to that. I think it's like BIPOC writers a lot of the times will be one that's called out as a hashtag. And then I would think for an op-ed, personally, most of the ones I've placed, again, I had a full draft, because if you don't know the person first, it's like, what do they know what you're gonna write? I think that's even more personal and probably something where it'd be good to have a full draft.
Yeah, and I think to also, with the op-eds, just make sure you know the particular specs of that outlet. I think that's really important, especially important when placing op-eds, because you're not going to have the same word count at that publication and the other publication. Okay, I'm going to go to Lisa Warden's question, which is, does it actually increase the chances of a pitch getting read if the email arrives in the editor's inbox at, say, 9:30 a.m. on a Monday morning versus if we send it at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night? Does it make that much of a difference? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I've seen a lot of freelance kind of gaming that out, like do it on a Monday when everyone is fresh and their brain isn't broken, or do it on a Friday when everyone's in a good mood because it's about to be the weekend. And I kind of don't think that that's a big factor, not a huge factor at least. I mean, it's true that if you do it over the weekend and you're pitching it to editors who maybe aren't going to be checking their emails over the weekend, they're going to have a lot to get through on Monday, and it might be a little bit more time before you hear back from them. But at this point, I mean, everyone is connected so much all the time that if it's a good pitch, to me, any time of the day isn't going to make that much of a difference. But that's just on my end.
Yeah, I tend to think it's like a matter of luck, personally. Like, it just depends on when you're catching someone. Like a really good pitch and a really good story could very easily slip through the cracks. Twilight, I think you were about to weigh in.
Sorry, my child's talking in the background. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's like, it makes maybe a 5% difference, but if it really matters, I would say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are probably the most successful days to pitch me, because Monday I'm overwhelmed and Friday I'm exhausted.
Yeah, it used to annoy me when people pitched at like 8 p.m. on a Saturday if I had the alert coming on my phone before I set the filter, where it was a whole separate inbox, so it didn't matter either way. But that was only because it reminded me they were living a lifestyle of freelance freedom and didn't matter to them what day it was. So yeah, I would say avoid Monday.
Yeah, let's just cancel Mondays just in general. So okay, I have a couple other questions. I just want to sort of take a 1,000-foot high view of this panel for just a second, just like to check in with everyone. So it is 1:00 Pacific, and we are going till 1:30. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do questions for like around 15 more minutes, and then we'll ask every panelist to like just give a final thought on like your best tip for helping people to succeed in their pitching. If you haven't weighed in yet, please feel free to ask a question or vote some questions up, because your questions are incredible and you're the ones doing this, so we want to hear from you. I have a question about money and pay, and I'm not actually sure what my question is, but I want to address it because, you know, I feel like, especially with like smaller publications, it's really difficult and potentially very unethical, like the way that freelancers are treated monetarily, especially for the amount of work that they're doing. And I guess I just wanted to, like, if anyone on the panel could weigh in with your thoughts on like what is reasonable, what is not, especially for like a new freelancer, someone who just wants to do this. Like, are they going to be able to pay their bills? What are your experiences and your thoughts? Anyone?
I think that the pay for freelancers who don't have a reputation yet is obscene. When I started it off, I was doing stories for like $250, you know, like a story that might take me 5 days. And you would think that the bigger brand name outlet you land, the more money you're going to get, but sometimes it works at the inverse, because the fancy designer outlets know that they can get away with paying a lot less because people just want to have that clip. Yeah, it was pretty unconscionable. And you know, when I started out doing this, I was not doing it full time. Like, I had other sources of income. I had other work. I was doing other work on trying to do this as a side hustle. And I can't imagine how anybody could do it any other way, based on the rates that outlets pay. Some outlets pay a hell of a lot more than others. And you should seek those places out. But, you know, like one of the piece that I was paid the least for, a story, I think it was a story that took me probably like 2 days in the field and maybe another 3 days to work on writing, plus photography. And I got paid $250 for that. And that was the New Republic, which is a fancy brand name publication. So yeah, that's my thought. I think it's garbage, and I don't really have, I don't really know what advice to give, because that's a personal decision about how you manage that, but it's really unsustainable.
Yeah, the only way I found to make it work was working for a nonprofit that I convinced to help support me on salary and let me freelance as part of the job. Otherwise, I would never have been able to do it. I don't think it's sustainable at all. And I know that's really discouraging to hear, but maybe that's one idea of an avenue to go at, or it's a way to just keep your expectations and in check. And freelancing is also a way you can begin to build enough clips to then maybe have a chance to apply to the admittedly like dwindling reporter positions that exist.
That's the first time in history anybody has ever said that they were able to make it work because of a nonprofit salary.
Any time that I was freelancing in my life, I think having some kind of anchor job, whether it's nonprofit or, you know, doing marketing, copywriting, social media, anything that you can have a guaranteed steady income that'll give you the freedom to do, to pitch and write freelancers, I think that's kind of crucial to full-time freelancers. I have fewer that can actually make a living doing that, which is very sad. I also want to recommend, there are a lot of resources out there, people compiling, kind of like Sonia Weiser, and I can't think of what they are off the top of my head. Study Hall, if anyone knows Study Hall, XYZ, they serve freelance opportunities every month. But a lot of these places are kind of compiling rates for different outlets, and I think you might be surprised if you get access to some of these spreadsheets that show, like, this is what I got paid for a 300-word piece at Bon Appetit or New Republic or whatever. You'd be surprised that the big outlets are paying less than some smaller ones. I mean, I don't really want to plug my own place, but we start 50 cents a word, which is maybe not the best or the worst, but it can be pretty tough there. When I first started writing, I was getting $15 per post. I was writing for a newspaper in San Francisco. It's just, I had to do it to get my name out there. It was a bummer.
Yeah, I think my first paycheck for writing was $35, and I still have the paycheck photocopied hanging out because it was a big moment. Okay, I want to make sure to get to the rest of the questions, so I'm just going to go through them now, and if we can just have like one person sort of weigh in on each question, that would be really great. So we've got a question from Jacqueline. She says, I work for We Animals Media. I love We Animals Media. And I said that part. And our challenge is putting our images on the radars of writers and editors to let them know we have a very big library of images and videos to help illustrate potential animal rights and vegan stories. Here's the question. How often do editors accept or reject pitches based on potential availability of images to pair with the writing? Or do you have suggestions for pitching potentially confronting images and videos to outlets that traditionally aren't willing to publish them? It's a great question. There's also another question about the images, so I'm going to tack that on, which is from Isabella. What are your thoughts about the writer providing photographs? So if someone could speak to those two things, that would be great.
It's always helpful. I would say that is, if you do have access to photography, that enhances. We pay a little bit extra if the writer actually provides their own photos, like original photography from themselves. But sometimes it could just be that you have access from one of the sources that you used. And if you say that straight up, that does give a little boost. I mean, we like visually oriented stories. It makes more people read them. So I think it's a good idea, if you know that in advance, to put that in your pitch.
I think for the We Animals question, but the reason why, perhaps the reason why that got crickets on this call is because I think I think you should be pitching photo editors. I think that, this is much more in their bailiwick, and I think the photographs are an afterthought for a lot of print editors. And the person who thinks first and foremost about that is the photo editor. And so, they'll put together a story and then they'll just toss it to the photo editor to deal with the graphical elements. If a photo editor has access to a bank of professional photography, which is not just on Getty Images, moreover, if they're getting it for free or for cheap, I would think that would be a pretty compelling value proposition to them.
And Jacqueline, who has asked the question, I'm sure you already know about this, but for anyone else who's interested in this subject, I recommend the documentary The Ghosts in Our Machine by Liz Marshall, because Joanne MacArthur is the subject of that from We Animals, and it really tackles this subject. Okay, so we have 3 more questions. I'm going to shoot this one over to Rachel. This is from Vanessa. Is it imperative to use Twitter? How helpful is it? And does anyone have any examples where Twitter brought success with pitching or creating relationships?
Yeah, for me, I found it was integral. I mean, I mostly wanted to ignore it when I was an editor, but once I was on the other side, it's how I did media relations for MFA back in the day when people got together face to face that hopefully we'll see again. I would basically like ask people out to lunch or coffee, and that was a really great way to sometimes build relationships. And obviously I had some leg up of already having my name out there, but you'd be surprised at, again, how amenable people are to kind of reaching out that way. And I guess it can't hurt to ask and to follow those people, but also, you know, don't bombard them with DMs or tweeting at them. You know, maybe be a little strategic of follow what they're doing first, you know, favorite what they're saying, retweet one of their or two of their stories, you know, in a sincere way, but before you ever come at them asking things, you know, be an individual, not spam bot. But yeah, it's important. And like I said, you know, go ahead, follow me on Twitter. That'd be great. Apparently I need to like build my following to write a book, and I hate doing that stuff. So that would be good. And then follow the people I'm following. Just go through that list and you'll find a ton of people I've had success with who are already sympathetic.
Is it just at Rachel Krantz? Okay. Okay, great. So just a couple more questions here, and then we'll shift to closing thoughts. So I'm going to go to Zach's question, which is, does brevity help, and how much? I'm surprised flattery is helpful since it takes up space, and my sense was editors don't read much text. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I remember when I first started out that someone somewhere gave me the advice that 3 paragraphs is the perfect pitch for getting it all in there. And I don't think that there really are any rules as far as that goes. I've thought about it ever since. That if you can try to get all the most compelling parts of the pitch into 3 paragraphs, including why your personal story, who you're going to talk to, what are some of the most graphic parts of the story itself. It's kind of an interesting exercise because it can feel like, wow, how can I put that all in there? But it's true that editors are already time pressed and may not have time to read, you know, even as much as we'd like to read a really lengthy pitch. So you can get the shorter that you can get all the information you need in there, the better. Yes.
Yeah, I think it was breaking up a little bit, unfortunately, but I got like 95% of that. Does anyone have anything to add about brevity? That's a funny question. Zach, I'll just add that, like, because I had brought up flattery before. I mean, like, really quick. Like, hey, I'm familiar with your work, especially this particular column. I liked it because of blah. Here's my pitch. And that is a great segue into Lisa's question, which I think will be the last question we're going to take before we switch to the closing thoughts, which is, seeing as editors get so swamped with pitches, should we describe the story we're proposing first in the body of the email and then tell them who we are, or should we start the email with our brief bio followed by the story idea?
If you have really good credentials already or some clips at impressive places, I think it can be good to just have one line first that links to, hi, my name is blah, blah, I've written for X, X, and X, and it's just the outlet's name is the hyperlink to the story. So it's kind of like you're showing your freelancer badge of like, I'm legit, and then just go straight into it. But I don't know if it's gonna make a huge difference either way in the end.
Some of these questions I think are kind of overthinking it. Like, what time should I send the email, and what should be in the first paragraph. It's like, if you have a good pitch, then pitch the good pitch. Like, I would worry much more about coming up with a compelling pitch and having a really good story than kind of how to optimize the chances of an editor using their fleeting time to be able to understand what your pitch is.
Yeah. I also think it's important to add, like, maybe in your signature, make sure you have a link to either your website or your LinkedIn page. I recently was pitched, I should add, I'm the content director at Kinder Beauty, and I do take pitches there, and they are paid. And someone pitched me recently. It was a really great pitch, and she had her LinkedIn, and I looked at it and I tried her out, and her story came back needing like an overhaul, and also then had some errors in it. So obviously this goes a little bit beyond pitching, but like it's really important, especially if you want to like keep these ongoing relationships with editors, to like just make sure that you're handing in like a solid fact check piece. And from where I stand, make sure there's a link so that to your work, so that you can keep your email to like around 3 paragraphs or so, as Jesse was saying. But if we want to know more, then we can easily find you. Okay, so that being said, I'd love to just go around with some final thoughts. It could either be something that you've already touched on or one of the other panelists has touched on, but if you could kind of make sure to speak to how those people who are joining us today could make sure to set themselves up for success. Because my guess is like everyone here wants to, you know, elevate their career to the next level. We all want to basically get the mainstream media to cover more animal rights stories. How do we do it? What do we do if we're new at writing? Anything you've got. So I'm going to go in the order that my Zoom is presented. So I'm going to start with Rachel.
Sure. Well, I think the best advice is kind of what you said earlier was given to you, and I really followed that too. Of, you know, find someone who's doing what you're already doing and reach out to them. That's been some of the. I mean, that's how we became friends, and yeah, that was professionally great for me, but also just personally great for me. Finding the people. So maybe that's. Yeah, other reporters and writers who might not be super famous, but are on their way in some step ahead of you to having the career you want, and reach out to them. People are more amenable now because they might have a little more time at home, but also be respectful of, you know, that potentially that would be something you're asking for consulting that might be paid or whatever, but it really can't hurt to ask or reach out and make that contact in that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Twilight, what about you? What are your takeaways for our lovely audience?
It sounds kind of basic, but read. I would rather than reading something of mine personally that you compliment or say something, you know, detailed about, I would rather have a sense from your pitch that you actually read our site, and that you have an awareness of the way that a lot of these stories are kind of ongoing, and that your piece is going to be one part of this ongoing story that we're telling. So get a sense of the way that we're telling these stories, and if it makes sense to fit yours into that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And also, I should have added that if anyone here, any panelists are currently taking pitches, then please announce that, because I'm sure we'll get some great ones, since everyone's going to be so good at pitching after this panel. I take pitches all the time, especially at Kinder Beauty, since we're building an editorial platform that speaks to the intersection of veganism, beauty, and inclusivity. So you could always reach out to me. Leighton, I loved what you had just said. I think that was an incredible takeaway when you said, like, maybe we're overthinking it a little bit. Maybe it's just like, got a good idea, share it. But do you have a different takeaway for our audience?
Well, a couple of things. The first one is that this is going to sound like a big bummer, but it's honest, that just bear in mind that you're coming into a broken industry, and it's only getting more broken. And you come as a freelancer, you're on the bottom rung. You know, it goes you, and then staff reporters, and then editors. So just be, you know, and I say this as somebody who's been freelancing myself for a long time, and I'm not a staff reporter anywhere. So just be prepared to be very frustrated and sometimes feel disrespected. it's just part of the job, and it's not you, it's not personal. It's just this is an industry in crisis. The other thing I would note is just a mistake. Well, maybe not a mistake, but something that I did that didn't really pan out was when I started out. I think that this is probably a natural inclination among freelancers. I pitched a lot of different outlets and tried to land stories with a lot of different outlets, under the presumption that if I could list a bunch of different fancy brand name outlets in my bio, that would get me more work. What I found over time was that that brings some ego gratification, but it didn't really serve me well. I just got underpaid by a whole bunch of different outlets with one-offs. I said this at the beginning, but I think it's much more important to find a home and find an editor who you work well with, an outlet that you respect and that respects you, and try to find somebody you're writing on a regular basis for. Right now, I could pitch. The places that I write regularly for and produce regularly for, I can get 5 pitches greenlit from those in the time that it would take to get one greenlit from an outlet that I don't know. And I have a track record. So that would be my biggest advice, would be to really think about the fact that this is, just like every industry, this industry is based on relationships. And so you should try to form them.
That's great advice. Thank you. And Jesse.
Well, I haven't really addressed this, but we actually do publish a lot of stories about the meat industry and the flaws in the meat industry. But I think that we're paying attention to this right now is just a recognition that we are a news outlet and there needs to be a news peg to this that's presented. Just from all sorts of different writers will write in about something that they're here's the cause, here's something that I would love to get a story. We don't do op-eds, really. I mean, we do some perspectives, which be partially reported, in my opinion, but for the most part, it's reported news. But there's a lot of problems with the meat industry as it stands. Lots of good angles come in. We do these stories all the time, so I think kind of just research it out and seeing what's new, seeing what is going to make this outlet would like to run. Oh, and I'm Jesse at thecounter.org if you ever want to pitch.
Well, yeah. Oh, I'll add, I'm Jasmin with no E. I'll put it here. Jasmin at kinderbeauty.com. Jasmin at vegnews.com. Okay. Well, these are incredible tips and just really thoughtful, valuable questions. So I'm so grateful to everyone who's been watching, and to our panelists, Rachel Krantz, Twilight Greenaway, Jesse Hirsch, Leighton Woodhouse, and to Anna Bradley at Sentient Media. Next month, the Sentient Sessions will continue with the session. We have Nothing But the Facts, fact-checking and verification for animal rights with Christopher Sebastian. In this session, Christopher Sebastian will offer insight and tools for fact-checking and explain why we must be consistent and thorough with the truth when it comes to reporting. That'll be on July 23rd from 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific time. And, I think that these Sentient Sessions are just an incredible opportunity for anybody who's looking to advance their writing, their careers, their advocacy for animals, and the way that we approach the media in general. So I think that's about it. So thank you everyone so much. And I think you could find all of us online. It's pretty easy. And follow Sentient Media as well. Thank you very much.